welcome to today's seminar. It's a great pleasure for IFN to host this presentation of the EEAG report for, I think, the 5th time. And given the topic of today about coping with change is something which is very relevant today. We have a lot of happening. Carolina told me she was discussing Brexit yesterday. We have trade wars maybe. We have technology that give opportunities, etc. So I think the topic of today will be extremely relevant for the future of Europe and Sweden. And we also have a very nice speakers here today. We have Giuseppe Bertola, who is a great researcher in the field of economics. He has done work on labor, he's done work in growth, institution, etc. But he also have worked a lot with policy. So I think this is really a nice combination of a skilled researcher doing the policy work also. We have Carolina Ekholm, professor in international economics, which also have produced very interesting work on international investments. But also she has done her practical part and has been participating in actually working in the central bank in the government. So we have that perspective also. And we have Mauro Gozzo, who has unique knowledge about the business sector, functioning of the business sector, and especially on export and foreign direct investment. For the one that use Twitter, we have hashtag IFN Europe that you could use. So basically, what I will do is also just briefly give you a hint of how I would like to see the agenda of today. So Professor Bertola will have a 20 minutes presentation of chapter 2 in the report. Then Professor Ekholm will give her comment 5 minutes. Mr. Gozzo will give his comments 5 minutes. Then we will have a discussion about 10 minutes where they interact and I ask some question. And then, like 9:45, I open up for questions from the floor. And then I would like to give them like 5 minutes to summarize how we should proceed to make Sweden and Italy and Europe better and improve. So with this, I would like to introduce to you Professor Bertola. Very welcome.
Thanks, Lars. Thanks for coming. It's very nice to be here, and I'm going to give you a very brief introduction for a moment about this thing, European Economic Advisory Group, because as you can see, we're very diverse, and the point is that we are trying to bring different perspectives, issues of common interest to Europe. Usually, very often, we talk about the issues arising in European integration. This year, no. This year, we are thinking about European disintegration in the following constructive sense. We are looking at how different countries were doing over time, and obviously, it's not only European integration. Many other factors have shaped the experiences of countries, and this is what I'm going to about today. And then, if you're interested, there are copies and it's on the internet. Parts of the report are also about Europe. How could it be influenced by things happening outside, the trade wars, Russia, immigration, and whether it would not be a good idea to be together instead of having all these fights inside. Well, let me show you this picture. And this picture is a picture of real per capita income, real meaning both over time and across countries. The Madison Project tries to make these things comparable. Relative to the Western European average, it's not the European Union, Switzerland is in there, but the Western European countries have been existing for a long time, and this data give us something, some idea about what has happened to different countries. There are 3 countries, in the transmission. One is Italy, one is Germany, and one is France, and disappeared in the transmission, sorry. And you can see, Germany and Italy were new in 1870. Italy was much poorer than the average of Western Europe. And then Italy has these experiences. You see, there was a world war. If you probably remember, there was a world war. Italy won. It was expensive, but won. Then Italy lost World War II, and then you see Italy climbing up, getting to just about European average, and then that's what we're going to talk about. And you can see that different countries have different experiences. In particular, in the wars in Europe, countries were not always on the same side, and that's obviously going to matter. Since we are in Sweden, everybody's probably curious to see how Sweden does in this picture. And if all goes well, yes, Series 4 is Sweden. And Sweden, as you can see, did well in the wars. Why? Because it stayed out, which is a very smart thing to do if you can. And you see, it makes a sizable difference. Sweden was as poor as Italy, and then it climbs up, stays out of World War II. That's great. And then you can see that over the period, the post-war period, Italy was doing well, was growing, Sweden was declining, and then Italy has been declining further, and in the discussion maybe we can discuss why Sweden stopped declining, did not really do so great relative to Europe, but at least it clambered up. This is the picture that is the focus of the talk. Again, I'm sorry about the slides are not exactly the same here. This is Sweden, and then again, keep in mind that Sweden exists. This is Italy. Italy between 1960 and 1992 was doing great. Between 1992 and now has been doing exactly the mirror image of its former self. So there is a big switch. So it's an interesting case study to look at Italy. What happened in 92? That's possible. 1992 was a special year for Italy. There is a TV series called 1992 because it's the year when the previous political system was wiped out by judicial investigations, and we got Berlusconi. So that was the big change. Other big changes happened. I came back from the US and started being full-time in Italy in 1992. It's a fact. But there were some economic, structural, industrial economic things happening in 1992. It's the year of the GSM, the World Wide Web, and it's also the year of the single market in Europe, and the beginning, part of the beginning of the globalization, China coming on, the wall coming down. These things matter, and they matter in different ways for different countries. Everybody knows, let's think about trade, that if you open a country through trade, usually the country as a whole does better, but inside the country some people will lose. Those who will be competing more furiously with outsiders, and some people will be doing better, those that become more scarce in the aggregate of the country and the world. And if you think about it, the same thing should be happening inside Europe. In 1992, Europe as a whole is becoming more open to external trade, and it's also becoming more open to internal trade. So the countries of Europe are sort of like people in an economy. And what is the difference between before and after? There is a picture that I would like to show you, and it focuses on two extreme sectors. On the left-hand side, you have textiles, wearing apparel, leather, so clothes and shoes. These are things that we began importing a lot from the outside world around the 90s. On the right, we have machinery and equipment not elsewhere classified. So no cars, no communication equipment. This is mostly machine tools. No locomotives, no cars, but machine tools. And then we have Italy, Germany, and France, left and right. This is production, this is employment, but let's focus on production. You can see that production of textiles declines everywhere. You can also see that Italy initially was a much bigger producer of textiles than Germany and France. You can see the machinery equipment increases everywhere because these are the things we now import, these are the things we now export. And you can see that Germany was a much bigger producer of machinery and equipment than Italy and of France. Italy does not do so bad in machinery and equipment. There is a big shock in the big crisis, but we stand up to Germany and the world in machinery and equipment. In textiles, understandably, things are very different. And you can see, the point that this is something that did happen, that Italy had to do something else, and doing something else is never so easy. So Italy used to be the China or the Vietnam of Europe, and it needed to change. Everybody curious about where Sweden is in this picture, I hope, because I have a slide that adds Sweden. This is amazing. I didn't know, but according to these data, which are the EU claims, I don't completely believe them, but they exist. No? In absolute value, Sweden is much smaller than Germany. But in absolute value, the production of machinery and equipment is very, very similar to the German one. So if there was a bad shock for a country, it was not Sweden. Sweden was in a position to do well in the new globalized and internally integrated Europe. Textiles barely exist in Sweden. They're even lower than in France. Okay, so food for thought. Now, is there more evidence? Yes, I show you a little bit more evidence that this is something that did happen to Italy. This is Italy, and we usually divide Italy in 4 parts: northeast, northwest, northeast, center, the south, and the Isles. If you hope it works. Okay, so this is the production of everything, GDP, no? All of it together in the northwest. And you can see that relative to Germany, Germany as a whole, Germany also has different types of regions and has the east and so on. To Germany, the northwest, up until 2007, 2008, was doing a little worse. But the northeast was actually doing better than Germany as the whole. Okay? And this is corroborating evidence. Italy is a large country with different specializations in different parts of Italy. The northeast is closest to Germany and Austria, so it's almost like being in Germany there. Meaning they don't speak German very well, but they act exactly the same way as Germans. And if you look at the center is doing pretty well. Why? Because there is a region here, Marche, Abruzzi, that is on the way to Germany in a way. No? And then there is the capital, so there are other reasons for doing well. If you look at the south, it's pretty dismal. The other thing that you can already see in this picture, in a way, this is all relative to Germany, to have a comparison. Things are happening in the world, are happening to Germany, are happening to regions within Italy. You can see that for a while they have these differences. And you can also see that from 2007, 2008, and especially in 2011, 2012, and then this data stop, the whole country has a problem. On the one hand, this corroborates the idea that there was a problem, it was a regional, a structural problem, that Italy needed to do something like it had done in the 60s. In the 60s, Italy was not standing still. Lots of people were moving from the country to the city with lots of problems. People barely understood each other, but Italy could cope with change. Here in this picture, you see that in the 2000s, Italy stopped coping with change. It was, at some point, everybody gave up on Italy. No investment, little consumption. Why? Because you don't know what's happening. You don't know where you're going. This is about Italy, but it's also about more general things. These kind of phenomena happen everywhere. They happen to people, they happen to regions, they happen to sectors. And one thing is what happens to you, and you cannot do anything about it, usually, many times. But then is how you react to this new thing. Individuals and regions, some gain from European Union globalization. And it's not only in Italy, Bavaria, they're now extremely proud, and we are based in Bavaria as the European Economic Advisory Group. But they should realize that Bavaria was poor and became rich thanks to integration. Veneto, similar, they want to secede from Italy. But they should realize that it's not that they are so good, it's that they are lucky. Flanders want to secede from Belgium. And again, it's not that they are better, it's that they are better now. They have Antwerp instead of having the coal fields, and that's a big difference. Other countries, other regions lose, the Ruhr in Germany, Wallonia. Nations exist. And part of the reason they exist is they are supposed to deal with these kind of things. You never know if Catalonia will still be the better place of Spain. It used not to be. Nations and potentially the European Union should be the place where these things are understood and dealt with. In Italy, the policy reactions that are needed when you need to change were a little bit lacking. Markets and politics are needed to cope with change. You need markets, you need it to be possible to change your specialization and be paid accordingly instead of having national bargaining institutions. Again, I'm simplifying a lot. No? Politics, you need to understand that sometimes things are good, sometimes things are bad, and you are in it together. This did not happen in Italy. There is evidence of misallocation, of low productivity, and of defensive redistribution. Nobody wants to give up anything. Everybody says, okay, it's mine. That's bad. It's not the way to cope with change. Psychologically, Italy had a problem. Italy is rich. It's still rich. Life is good. And if you're rich enough to be complacent, there is this what crisis feeling. No? The restaurants are full. Where is the crisis? And the crisis, unfortunately, is potentially very much there because it all matters what you expect of the future. If you have this large debt and people stop believing that you will be able to repay, the crisis is here. It's a cliff. On the other side of the cliff, there is Libya, there is Venezuela, and people are beginning to be aware of it, but not enough. The crisis did come, 2010, 2011. Everybody lost faith in the future. Big crisis. Debt crisis, but it's really a crisis of the system. This dangerous debt spiral, no consumption, no investment, is really a sign of having lost track of what you need to do to get out of the situation. Things have been better recently a little bit, no? Because thanks to Draghi and Trump, exports pulled us out of the brink, really. Reforms. Let me show you one picture. It is in the report without details. People say, oh, reform and everything will be fine. It's not that simple. It's simplistic to say reform. Reform for reform's sake is not a good idea. You need to understand what is the problem and how the reform can help and convince the people that this is really a good idea. You know that the OECD is the one in charge of always saying reform. The ECB says, do the reforms. Let's look at the OECD. The OECD has a series of indicators. No? They call them go for growth policy reforms. And in the regressions, you can see that these indicators are associated with better growth performance. These regressions always include Sweden, sometimes they even include Luxembourg, so the small countries that do the right thing and then they grow. Whether it's causal, we don't know. Maybe Sweden is Sweden. No? But if you look at Italy, France, and Germany, which is a better experiment because they are comparable, they're big, heterogeneous, they're shaken, and Germany is on one side, Italy is on the other, and France is exactly in between. France is a little bit like Italy, structurally, and a little bit like Germany. These lines, and I'm not going to go through all of them, these lines display what happened in the various countries over time between 1995 and 2013, the data that exists. No? You might expect Germany to be always doing the right thing. Not true. For example, product market regulation, Germany is terrible, is going the opposite way. No? Temporary contracts, it's true, Germany did big reforms, no? The hard reforms in the labor market, but Italy, according to this data, did exactly the same thing. France is the one that is stuck. But Italy, on paper, has not been not doing the reforms. What was really missing, I think, and we can discuss, no, was not just doing the reform, but believing in the reforms. It's a mindset, believing that you need to change. Italy did poorly in this scheming about the reform, in this convincing yourself that it's a good idea to change with an explanation. There are pros and cons for different people, but in the end, we share. Now, Italy, no, because we are trying to be topical, every year we choose something that is likely to be topical. Right now, Italy is not so as bad as it looked back in June when we decided Italy was the topic. But the problem that was apparent in June is still here. the government we have in Italy now, seen through the lens of the speech I've been giving you, is exactly the wrong kind of government. Again, 60% of the Italians like it, so probably they are doing something good. But if you are in the business of explaining to the people what to do, they are not the right government. Because it's nostalgic, there is this make your country great again idea, which is exactly wrong. It's not the right way of doing it. It's uncompromising. They want different strange things, and they cannot even agree between themselves. Compromise is the recipe for reform. It's a populist government of this type, and that's not right. If you look at the kind of reforms they've been doing, because they call themselves the government of change, so they apparently should be reading this paper. They increase labor rigidity, they do early retirement, public deficit are back in something they would like to do. They want to nationalize the highways, the airlines, and so on, and the speech they give is that it was like that in the 60s when Italy was doing so well. And what is difficult to understand for many people, not for economists, is that things were different then. The kind of challenges Italy was facing were serious, but different from the ones we have now. Back then, we were able to exploit opportunities for change. And again, not everybody was doing better, but the country as a whole also introduced a lot of instruments to share this new welfare. Understanding that different times are different for every country is the key to understanding. Finding good examples is not easy. The rest of the chapter is about let's look for a good example. And we came out with Finland, but with some reservations. It's difficult. Germany is not really a good example because it's not that they reform. They were lucky. They had the kind of crisis that was good for them. It can happen to any country, and my German friends are now worried because it could be happening to Germany now. This thing that what you do is out of fashion, diesel cars. The bad example is really interesting. It's better to have a bad example than a good example because you understand and you realize the kind of things that are good to do. You need to be basing the reaction to the circumstances. It's not do the reforms the Germans do. It's not become Danish. Those are stupid recipes. It's not the right. Do not do what you were doing when the country was doing better because it's not causal. The country was doing better for reasons to understand. There is this thing about personality. Different countries have different personalities. There are different people have different personalities. And it's important to realize that. To realize that some countries find it easier, some countries find it more difficult, and analyze the reasons why. Sweden, whether it's because it's so close to Russia, whether it's because it's so cold, there are things that can make it different to be a Swede than to be an Italian. But everybody needs to understand that being a country means finding a way through markets and policies to share the gain and losses of change, because otherwise you end up in a place where nothing changes, but you're in a stalemate. And usually, if you're in a stalemate, you're also on the verge of a bad crisis. Okay, 20 minutes.
What the timing. Thank you.
No, I use the technology.
So, please, Carolina.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for this very interesting presentation. And let me start by saying that the report in itself, as always with the EEAG reports, it's a very interesting and rich one. It deals with a lot of different topics related to the European economy. And I think it is always one of the best reports to read if you're interested in European economics. Now, obviously, I'm not going to delve into the full report. I'm going to just give a couple of comments related to what Professor Bertola has just presented. And that is, of course, the part of the report that deals with Italy. And I think that focusing on Italy was a good choice by the group. even though it may have appeared more topical when you decided on doing it than today. But the problems facing Italy, it's really something that poses something like a existential threat to the European Union, or at least the European Monetary Union. So it's important to understand the difficulties facing Italy, I think, for all EU countries. Now, in this part of the report, as Professor Bertola described, I mean, there's an account of the characteristics of Italy and the problems facing Italy, but there is also an account of different reform experiences with a few cases that I think are at least read as good examples, and where Sweden is one of them. And then there are a number of northern EU member states where reform has had a more successful outcome than in Italy. I think when you read it, it's the narrative is a little bit like you know, you have these good examples in the north, and maybe Italy could learn something from those good examples, given that Italy seems so have such difficulties in dealing with structural change in a constructive way. And I think when Professor Bertola presented this now, he was very nuanced, I think, in also emphasizing that Italy could perhaps never become Germany or Sweden, because ultimately these countries are so different in an institutional perspective. And I think I'm a little bit of course, it's a flattering way of reading different reform examples, because obviously we are singled out as one of the good guys here. But it's a narrative that I'm not entirely happy with. And partly it is because what Professor Bertola also emphasized, that there are these fundamental institutional differences. Italy could never become Sweden and vice versa. And this is to some extent acknowledged in the report. I think it was acknowledged even more in the presentation. Another reason why I'm not entirely enthusiastic about this narrative is that it feeds into a north-south division in the European Union that is already there. And I have probably contributed to this division myself when I have been in Brussels representing Sweden. And I think it is this narrative that, while in the north we are responsible, we deal with problems in a effective and competent way, but in the south you have all these irresponsible people, and they just seems to be unable or not competent enough to deal with the problems in a constructive way. And I think that kind of narrative is not very helpful at this point. And I think, as Professor Bertola also emphasized, we are all in this together, and it's in everyone's interest to deal with the problems facing also countries such as Italy, because it's their problem is part of our problems. But anyway, I think the account of the different reform experiences, it's very interesting, and it's something that we could have discussed more. But I think when I read it, I find it quite striking that in all the successful cases covered, and these are Sweden, Denmark, Finland, Germany, and the Netherlands, a very important role seems to have been played by the social partners in contributing to having wage growth in line with productivity developments. Because typically in a crisis, you know, there could be all kinds of things going on and underlying causes, but very often there is this loss of competitiveness. I mean, there's an interesting section in the report discussing what competitive really means. But Typically it's because wages are growing out of line with productivity, and of course for a country in a currency union that's really problematic, and that's something that is part of Italy's problem. Now in these northern countries the social partners seems to have contributed in an important way to deal with this. But it's not clear to me whether the social partners could ever play this role in Italy. I don't know enough about Italian labor markets to say that, but that could be one of these more fundamental institutional differences that makes it difficult to compare notes. Now, I think it seems appropriate to focus on reasons behind slow growth in Italy, which is done in the report, rather than other aspects of Italian economy, such as the fiscal policy or the banking system. I think it's certainly correct that the worryingly high debt ratio in Italy now, and that is also feeding these more acute problems regarding sovereign interest rates on sovereign debt, that has more to do with weak economic growth than any fiscal excesses since the adoption of the euro. Now, the weak banking system is, of course, a problem in Italy, and the fact that they hold a very large share of Italian sovereign debt creates this risky feedback loop between increased risk premia on sovereign debt and increased risk premia on bank funding. Now, it's in nobody's interest to have Italian supervisory authorities or euro area supervisory authorities to deal with this in a way that triggers a full-blown banking crisis in Italy. And you know, if you manage to get higher growth, it would alleviate these kinds of problem. It would strengthen the banks. It would strengthen public finances. Still, you have to wonder whether it is possible to get growth going with such a weak banking system. You know, how are growth-enhancing investments going to be financed given the way the banking system looks now? So I think I'm going to end with this. I see that Lars is getting really worried here. But I'm going to end by saying that I think the key questions that should be asked when it comes to problems in Italy is, you know, what are the few, sort of very few, both crucially important but also feasible reforms in an Italian institutional context that could set Italy on a path towards higher growth. And so if I have a question to Professor Bertoli, it's, you know, what would be interesting to hear what you think would be these few crucially important and feasible reforms that could lead to a stable and prosperous Italy.
Thank you very much, Fredrik. So Mauro, and then Giuseppe will answer afterwards. Please.
Thank you. Nice to be here. It was very nice also to read your report. It put a lot of questions, and I'm an economist who has been very much working earlier with this, with comparing countries with each other. So I have not been so much dealing with Swedish economy traditionally, and I think this is very important to remember. We don't actually have a Swedish economy. We have a global economy of which we are part, and that is also of course the case for Italy. And your comparisons of per capita income corrected with PPP were very interesting to look at, because normally you just compare GDP or GDP growth. I think that economists too often focus too much on the macroeconomic balance and over all reforms. And just as you said, you can do the wrong things and still be successful, as Germany, obviously, when you look at certain things they have done or not done, you should say. I agree with what Carolina said, that it's silly to talk too much about the difference between North and South in Europe. Sweden and Italy has, as you can see from one of your slides, big similarities. And that's the catching up. Between 1870 and 1970, Sweden had the highest growth of all countries of the world. And we thought, we can never do mistakes. Then in the 80s and the 90s, Sweden had the lowest growth, at least I think statistical series have been somewhat corrected. But when I analyzed Sweden and other countries in the early 2000s, I noticed that Sweden had the lowest growth of all Western nations over the 70s and 80s, really disastrous. And it ended with a crisis. But in some way, we were very successful. And of course, politicians today say, we took Sweden out of the crisis. That's what the left says. But and the right says, no, we were the ones who made the early reform. We lost power in 94, but it was our reform that were the reform. But I think, just in a way like Germany, Sweden was a little lucky. Other things that have not been talked so much about is the relaunch of the entrepreneurial system in Sweden. And Sweden in the 90s managed to get a fast growth in the ICT industry with the growth of a company, Ericsson, which in a few years came to have 10% of Swedish exports. That is 5% of GDP, just one company. If that could also not have happened, because in Ericsson they were discussing earlier on, should we put emphasis on this radio telephony, it was called, or should we lay it down? We are a telephone company. They made the right decision. They could just have made the opposite decision, and history for Sweden had been somewhat different, actually. So this is often how things think, and you should go down, I think, more on the micro level and see what is happening. Because I think that very much about the Italian economy circle a lot about the institutional factors around the entrepreneurial sector. Italy differs very much from other advanced European economies by its large number of firms, enormous amounts of firms in Italy. And worse, the productivity levels in these firms are enormously dispersed, just as you mentioned on page 49 in your report. What does it tell us? Yes, it tells us that the creative destruction system of capitalism, in the Schumpeter way, is weak in Italy. Small firms are also favorized in legislation and different things. So they remain in the market, taking shares from larger, more competitive firms. The international exporting firms of Italy do not have low productivity. Sometimes they are global market leaders. They are on the productivity top, but they're not many enough in a country with 60 million people. So this is a particularity of Italy, and if you read the statistical office of Italy, they do very good reports, actually, very much analyzing these things very much. Since the financial crisis in 2008, actually exports have been the expansive factor in Italy, which you also mentioned in your speak. And this is contrary to the theory that, well, the difficulty for Italy is that they adopted the euro. If they hadn't done that, they could have devaluated. But it's not exports that's weak. Exports is actually the expansive thing. What is weak is consumption, and that is because income are too dispersed with big diffusion of productivity in the companies. Also, incomes are, of course, dispersed. Can Italy find something in the Scandinavian economy? Just as you mentioned, it's difficult to import things from other countries. You mentioned flexicurity, and some labor reforms have been done, but it's difficult with labor reforms. I work today as an economist for the negotiating parties in the labor market. I know that they're watching what they have, and they don't like change. And this is their area which is most difficult to attack in some way. But reforms are necessary, and some have been done, actually. I would like to raise a smaller thing that you could look at. the system for venture capital. As I understand, venture capital is quite weak in Italy. Sweden, just as most of Europe, was in the 80s a country with a Rhine capitalist system, very far away from the Anglo-Saxon model. But in 1984, we did a small reform, forgotten by most of people, the so-called allemansfondsparande, all-man funds, you could say, that were subsidized saving in equity funds. That slowly turned the Swedes into first equity fund owners, later equity owners. And from that, the step was not far from investing in non-listed firms, and venture capital was created. In a much smaller scale than United States, but still what we see in Sweden, that we have this steady flow of new interesting startup companies. And that is a particularity that we have got. I think it's one of the better schemes in Europe. And that contributes a lot to the economy. And the difficulty for Italy is not. You have some good companies. I will come back to this in the discussion then. But you have too few new companies.
So this was
Thank you.
excellent. Thank you very much. And we'll ask you up all to discuss. Bertola, and you could stand here, all of them. Stand here.
Okay. So it's stay in the middle. Okay, so it's okay. I can do without the table.
Okay, thank you very much. So Professor Bertola, do you want to respond a little? I think you get really great questions, so
Thanks,
both from Carolina and Mario. Do you want to kind of give like 2 minutes response to them, and then we
Yes,
continue?
you stop me at 2 minutes.
Yeah, I'm trying. Yeah.
No. Let me start from the question by Carolina. What are the few key reforms? And really, it's not in the spirit of the speech to say 1, 2, 3. But, for example, you're right that social partners play a big role. In Italy, it's too big to have a big role for the social partners. It worked in the 90s. In order to get on the euro, there was wage restraint to negotiate. Then people like me and my friends who have been saying that once you are in the euro, you need decentralized bargaining, regional, sectoral, and the role of the union should becoming weaker. And it did become weaker. Not anymore the way to find a consensus. Confindustria, also the union of the employers has become weak. So on the labor market, the kind of reforms we need is a better way to agree on employment relationships and wage levels than through these national agreements, together with reforms of the finance. That's the other leg of the thing. Like we say in the report, there are very many small firms, and many of these firms have family owners, no? And if the child is not as smart as the father, it's a big problem. The banks are not as bad as it looks. They're not as bad as in Germany, for example. And you are right, I agree that much of the current difficulties are due to the economic difficulty. Because Italy has been doing so badly economically, its banks have been doing badly. And I think it's good to stop here just to remind the audience of what has already been said. And I agree, and thanks a lot for the comments.
So just following up, Professor Bertola, so one thing that strikes me here is that it's coping with change, making reforms, but it's crucial to make the right reforms. And in some way, you're discussing productive reforms. I would say that Sweden made a lot of reforms in the 70s and 80s. So it was not the reform tempo or pattern that was a problem, but rather that it was reforms that was not giving incentives and didn't give dynamics into the business sector, etc. So the key seems to be to get maybe new firms, young people, power and productive. And my picture of Italy is that this is one of the crucial things about that the young people, new firms, etc., don't get that power. Could you kind of elaborate on why you think Italy has that problem and Sweden might not had it not before, and maybe have it in the future?
I let other people talk about Sweden. In Italy, the problem is there, and it's the problem of a generational situation where the parents have become richer and they really think everything is fine the way it is, because it did work in the post-war period, and it was, they call it a miracle, but again, looking at it, it was not a miracle. It was hard work and complicated relationship. The unions did play a role that there. And it's true that Italy is not giving enough voice to the young people. And again, the only thing I'm saying is that this is understandable if you think of Italy becoming rich so quickly, and then having problems and not realizing the problems are there. And it's a fact that the Italian young people tend to go abroad. Internal migration is starting again, but if you are moving from Calabria, from the south, to somewhere else, why should you stop in northern Italy? You go directly to Germany. So the young people have a problem, and the problem is a problem of communication and psychology in a country that up until 15 years ago felt like everything was fine. We don't realize we are really on the verge of, if we didn't have the euro, would do nothing to the exports because it would be Libya by now. And that's the situation.
So following up on another point that you stress in the report is really about the luck or unluck. So the Italian business sector and sectoral structure was such that it was in trouble. And then you're saying, raising this issue about Germany might have in the future, with China competing, etc. We might see that Germany had the problem. So I was thinking, Carolina, if you think in some way that this is on EU level, so should we be worried about that some countries is very specialized? That's kind of the idea, that you would like to have comparative advantage, but at the same time some countries like Italy now had this very strong focus on one sector and hit very much, where Sweden were more diverse. Is that kind of an ideal that we, because migration don't work really within the EU?
I think the experience with sort of European integration and the kind of structural adjustment that European integration created is that it wasn't so much creating specialization across industries. It was, I mean, all the literature about intra-industry trade really is related to the observation that the trade growth between high-income countries was very much trade within sectors. And I think the problems for Italy when it comes to the textiles, or to the clothing and clothes and shoes, it's not related to EU integration. It's related to competition from China and these kinds of countries, and the way it has been dealt with. Of course, Sweden did, I mean, your time series were quite short, and so it didn't appear that we had a textile industry here at all. But of course, we did have one back in the days, but it was lost much earlier. And I mean, that was quite traumatic in a way, but it happened.
Thank you very much. So, Mauro, you had a comment?
When it comes to the structure of the Italian economy, I think it's not so much problems within manufacturing. It's one thing we can see is the important sector, business services. Italy is a little behind, and if we look at the different European studies on productivity growth, you can see that countries where business services has been important, there's evidence that business services improve productivity also in manufacturing, which means that business services is very important. If you see much of the renovation of industry is due to a growing sector of business services. Even here, the German example is a little different. Germany is an outlier in many ways in Europe. So I agree with what you said. Don't copy Germany, because I think that's very difficult to do, and you could copy the wrong things, because Germany is an outlier here. But for most other countries, when it comes to manufacturing, the manufacturing sector is healthy generally in Italy, but it's not growing so fast, and that's the same as in all other countries. That since the 2008 crisis, manufacturing's growth has been very weak everywhere. Actually, services has grown. So I think it's more this that Italy still is too dependent on manufacturing. That is a problem. When it comes to textile, or I would prefer to say fashion, because fashion is the business today. Italy, just as all other highly advanced companies, they have outsourced most of it, except the high level. They're very expensive. You can manufacture them at home, but that's made abroad. I have very
So
good.
I have to open up for questions from the floor. Yes, we have one.
Thank you. My name is Hubert from Linnaeus University. I have a question, whoever wants to answer the question, and that is about a little bit more detailed on institutions. As far as I know, for example, the court's jurisdiction is working very slowly and ineffectively. To what extent does that mean an impediment to economic growth and other institutional changes that certainly are necessary? I think we should name some of these institutional things, because new institutional changes take a lot of time. It's maybe a matter of generations many times, and I think if Italy any time will perform much better then and get more stable in the future, I think these needs should be evident and worked on.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to?
Yeah, it's undoubtedly true. On the other hand, the courts were slow before 92, they're still slow now. And so we focus on 92, and there's no big difference between before and after. This is the defense for not mentioning the courts. The other thing to say is that the courts are expensive. No? And like we say in the report, some countries may find that having inefficient courts and so putting more of the negotiation at a different level is not completely nonsense. No? It's possible that that's a good idea. Courts, employment protection instead of unemployment insurance, it depends on the tradition, on the history. But I am agreeing that it's an important thing. No? I'm not saying it's too simple to say, let's fix the courts. That's
But you should
not
not
enough.
compare to 92, because things have been changing a lot in the world, and the whole global economy has been changing. So it's
Yeah, but
really
the courts has actually accelerated since 92, meaning
Okay.
there was
thank
a
you. We will-
reform of the civil code that helped. If you want to do the difference before and after, the courts is not really I'm agreeing in principle. In the case study, I'm not
Okay.
so sure.
Thanks. We have more questions here. So Michael.
Thank you. I'm Michael Treskov. I've been doing business all my life in Italy, and with big business. And it's interesting to see that up to the year 2000, it was a fantastic development. We invested. From the year 2000, we started to de-invest. And the question was what? It was a cost crisis and a productivity crisis. And it was very easy to follow. And now you can see it continues. One of the observations or conclusions we drew at that time was that Italy had difficulties to accommodate the euro, which means the old tradition to constantly devalue the cost increases was not possible any longer. Was that the right conclusion?
Yes, yeah, very briefly, because otherwise Lars gets angry. But yes and no, meaning there was a component of joining the euro and having less wage restraint than before, especially in the public sector. It was finally the interest rate has gone down, so we can give some wage raises and so on. A little bit of relaxation. But again, if you look at the experience, the bigger chunk of the productivity slowdown and the crisis was already after 92. And there is a little bit of an acceleration, and that's it. And maybe in the segment of the Italian economy you're looking at, that was the most important thing. But like before, I'm saying it's not enough to say it's the euro. It's the euro, the lack of reaction, but not only to the euro, to market integration.
Excellent. Thank you. So Morten. We have a question down there.
Hello, Scott Sutherland, Ministry of Finance. Thinking about Italy's ability to adapt and reform, one of the things which strikes me about Italy is that technocratic governments or administrations have played quite an important role there since '92. I think Ciampi, then Monti. Renzi wasn't a technocrat, but he wasn't elected. But many of the reforms have been implemented by these administrations, and it doesn't look like you will be able to have a technocratic administration again, based on the way that politics in Italy has changed. So I wonder what your reflection there is looking forward. Is there going to be an ability to have reforms, given how the political situation has changed, and can technocracy make a comeback?
Very briefly again, like the technology may unfortunately make a comeback if there is a crisis. It's clear that if this government falls, there will be election, but in the meantime the president will appoint somebody technocratic. It's true that many reforms have been made by technocratic governments, but that's not the solution. It's a symptom of the fact that the politics is in disarray since '92 or so. We do not have a way to discuss with each other how to compromise and share the cost and benefits of change, which is the slogan. Given this, when the crisis comes, technocrats will be needed, because otherwise there is no consensus.
Okay, thank you very much. Time rushes. 1 hour is not so long. So I will ask the panel to kind of give their main advice, how to coping with change, what's kind of the key institutional feature that we need to think about to kind of coping with change and the problems, but also capturing the benefits with AI, etc. So I would let Carolina start, and then Mauro, and then Professor Bertola will end. Okay, please.
Yeah, that's a very simple question. But let me just then point to two things. I mean, first, going back to what I was saying about the banking sector. I mean, I think maybe it would be worthwhile to focus on the Italian banking sector, just to avoid ending up in a full-scale banking crisis, because then everything becomes so completely chaotic. And it could, maybe if you manage to stabilize the banking sector, maybe then you will also have the time and the energy to do other things that would be important to boost underlying growth. But then also wanted to pick up on something that Professor Bertola said, that compromise is the recipe for reform. So I think if you look at when it comes to constitutional reform, I would think hard about things that maybe could be done in order to promote a more an environment that would be more conducive to reform, because I think it would be important for Italy to have a democratically elected government that is actually able to do something constructive, and not to alternate between governments that do really bad things and then having technocrats that don't have a democratic support.
So thank you very much. Great answer and difficult questions. I will ask more difficult questions to you later. So Mauro.
Oh yeah, Professor Bertola has raised the question of making comparisons and making comparisons over a long time, and I think that's very helpful to do. And in the long run, that's when you see how things can change a lot in countries. And it's important to look at all factors, not only macroeconomic issues, but also microeconomic, like the competition system. How is competition working in the country? And I raised myself this with the Schumpeterian, the creative destruction system. It has to work so companies can grow and companies can disappear, and new companies can arrive in the market and grow. This is a little what United States been so successful in, actually. while at the same time United States is not very successful with their old multinational firms. European firms are more competitive generally, and still they are always beating us, and this is a very good thing to learn about,
So
and I think that's
the key.
what we should in some way discuss more.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you very much. So Giuseppe, now you have 1 minute to kind of summarize everything in a nutshell.
There is one message of our discussion really is that we and the public should always understand what's going on, which is always a mix of something that is out of control and something you can do something about. And this is very difficult. I'm not saying it's easy, but if you don't even try, it won't happen. Example, constitutional reform. In Italy, there was this attempt by Renzi to at least do something that was forward-looking, and maybe you don't agree, maybe not, but at least it was something that was a plan. It was voted down, but it was voted down because Italy was in the slumps, and if it had happened 6 months later with Trump and Draghi finally pulling us out a little bit, it would have passed, I'm convinced. And luck matters a lot, so the recipe to do better is be lucky.
I think we were very lucky with the speakers today, so it was a great seminar, and thank you very much for a great
Thanks.